Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
I am going to start at the end for a second, because that is the moment that keeps replaying in my head like a clip I cannot scroll past. The second I held the trophy and looked straight into the lens and said, very calmly and very clearly, that this was for the people who did not show, and I felt the room freeze while a few people who knew me well sucked in their breath. But to understand why that line came out of my mouth without shaking, you have to know what it cost to finally say it out loud and how long I let my family write my story in pencil while I kept erasing myself to keep the peace. I had told them about the debate finals months before, not in a casual throwaway way, but with all the details and reminders a grown daughter gives when she is trying not to sound needy. As if she is asking for something unreasonable when really she is just asking to be seen, and I sent a real invitation to the family group chat with the date and the time and the location and the link for people who preferred to watch online. Because I know how life gets, and I tried to remove every excuse in advance so that the only thing left would be the choice to care. My mom responded with a heart and a sentence that sounded warm enough on the surface, but had that familiar thinness to it, the kind that lets you know she is not making any promises. My dad sent a thumbs up and a joke about not understanding the topic, but cheering anyway, and my brother, Ben, did not reply for days, which is a pattern I used to ignore because ignoring the pattern felt easier than naming it. And when he finally wrote back, he said they were thinking about doing something casual at his place that weekend, but he would try to figure it out, which is the exact phrasing that has followed me since high school awards nights and college showcases and work recognitions. This gentle shrug of a sentence that tells you everything you need to know about where you rank. I tried to be strategic and kind at the same time, which is a combination I am tired of pulling off, so I said I could come by after the finals if they wanted to keep it that day, or maybe they could come to my event, and then we could all head over together. And my mom said something about the timing being tight and the grill being borrowed and the neighbors coming early, and I nodded even though we were texting, because nodding has been my role for as long as I can remember, and I told myself not to make it a bigger thing than it needed to be, that maybe they'd surprise me and show up for the last round or at least watch the stream, that maybe this time would be different. On the morning of the finals, my coach handed me a note she keeps in her pocket for people she believes in, and it said something simple about showing up for yourself when no one else does, and I laughed because it felt corny and perfect and also like a dare. And I put my phone on silent except for the group chat because I was stubborn enough to want to see the one message that would finally land, the one that would say, "We made it, we are here, we see you," and I should have known better, but the hope sat there anyway like a habit I had not broken yet. The first ping came right after the semifinal ended, and I let myself glance down during the break, and there it was, not a text but a photo, the kind of wide, smiling shot people take at the start of a day when everything is going their way. And I watched my family in that frozen square, my mom with a platter, my dad near the cooler, and Ben in the middle like he always is, with a caption that said, "Kicking off the barbecue. Everyone come hungry," and there were cousins in the comments and neighbors and a few of my parents' friends, and all I could think was that no one even pretended to be discreet. No one even lied about traffic or a headache. They were simply not there and not watching and not sorry. I stood there with my phone in my hand and the old scripts tried to load, the ones where I tell myself I am oversensitive or I should be more understanding or that family is complicated and love does not always look like attendance. Except love does sometimes look exactly like attendance, and pretending otherwise has kept me quiet for years. So I took a breath that was not pretty or measured, and I made a choice that felt like a small burn in my chest, because if they were going to choose the barbecue, then I would choose me, and I would stop apologizing for the cost of that choice. I did not cry, which is not because I am brave, but because I was past crying and somewhere closer to a cold focus I have only touched a few times in my life, and in that focus I did something tiny and mean and absolutely fair. And I am not going to apologize for how good it felt in the moment, because I opened the family group chat, the one named after a dog we no longer have, and I pasted the live stream link again, and I wrote, "In case your other plans fall through." And I changed the chat name 2, other plans, and then I left the conversation so that every time they opened their phones they would see the new title and the empty space where my name used to be, and if that was petty, then so be it. Because sometimes the only way to make a point that sticks is to write it where people cannot avoid it. My coach called me back to the prep room and I tucked my phone away and went through the arguments again, not because I was afraid I would forget them, but because it steadied me to remember that I had done the work. That whatever happened in the next hour would not be about whether my family cared enough to clap. It would be about whether I cared enough to stand there and take up space I had earned, and the strangest calm came over me. The kind you get when you are done negotiating with yourself and ready to act. I will not pretend the hurt disappeared, because it did not, and it would be a nicer story if I could say their choice lit a fire and I rose above it without any bitterness. But the truth is I carried the bitterness into that room like a secret weight I did not have to put down, and I planned to convert it into something clean and sharp, and maybe that is not the kind of transformation you put on a greeting card. Yet it is the kind that gets you through a door without waiting for someone to hold it. I know there are people who will say I should have called them and asked again or tried one more time to bridge the gap or not made a scene later. But the thing about gaps is that the person standing on the smaller side is always the one asked to build the bridge. And I have been the bridge for years, so on that day I decided to be the person who crosses, not the structure that holds everyone else up, and that decision tasted like relief mixed with adrenaline and a little fear, which is a recipe I can live with. When they called my section to line up for the final round, I felt the whole room tighten in that way competitions do right before the last stretch, and I kept my face steady and my hands still. And I promised myself that whatever came out of my mouth on that stage would be the truth of how hard I had worked and how much I believed I belonged there, and also, quietly and without telling anyone. I promised myself that the last thing I said into a microphone that night would not be in my prepared remarks, because if my family had chosen not to witness me, then I would witness myself and make sure the record reflected it. And that is the moment I will leave you with for now, because the tiny revenge in the chat was only the first move, and the thing that happened in front of the cameras was not an accident or a slip of emotion. It was the end of a plan I started the minute I saw the barbecue photo, and the part you are waiting for, the part that made Ben walk out while the flashes were still going, did not come from anger alone but from something sharper and more final. Which is exactly what I carried with me as I stepped toward the podium and decided I would not swallow another thing that night. If you have ever been the person who keeps the calendar for everyone else, because if you do not, your life gets scheduled around you without a second thought, then you already understand the kind of quiet training I had long before this final. Because for years I learned to make my own milestones small enough to slide under other people's plans, and I told myself it was maturity or flexibility or just how families work, except the longer I did it the more I felt like I was standing on the curb, watching my own life drive past, which is why, after the barbecue photo hit my phone like a dare, I sat down and built a plan that I should not have needed, a plan that did not ask for anybody's blessing. And I am not going to pretend I did not enjoy how calm I felt once the steps lined up in my head. I started with the pattern because patterns are the only honest part of family arguments, and ours was simple enough that a stranger could map it in a few minutes. My brother, Ben, takes up the middle of the room with whatever he is doing, and most people orbit without thinking. My mom smooths the parts of the story that make him look less shiny. My dad turns anything difficult into a joke that doubles as an exit, and I anticipate, accommodate, and apologize, so when I replayed all the nights that looked just like this in smaller ways, the choir concert they left early to beat traffic, the internship celebration they forgot because the game ran long, the time I came home with a scholarship letter while Ben bought a used smoker, and everyone gathered around it like he had brought home a trophy, I told myself I would not rewrite that script again. Not this time. Not when I had finally made it to a stage that had my name on it. My coach, Hannah, asked me during warm-ups what I needed from anyone before the last round, and for once I said it straight. I said I needed someone to capture the moment cleanly so there would be no argument later about what was said or who was there. And I needed the words I had been afraid to say out loud to be ready and precise, not sloppy from adrenaline, and she nodded in that way she does when she hears a strategy, not a plea. Then she handed her phone to one of our first years and told him to film the award segment tight on my face so the audio would be crisp, and she wrote a single sentence on an index card and slid it to me, a sentence that sounded plain and undeniable. And seeing it in ink calmed me more than I expected because it meant I was not going to improvise my feelings or back away from them at the last second. Next, because I am not above using the tools that usually get used on me, I opened the list of contacts who float around my parents' world like friendly witnesses, the neighbor who always posts in the community group, the aunt who loves to tell people she supports ambitious girls, the couple from church who never misses a chance to clap for anything that looks like achievement, and I sent each of them a quick, easy note, the kind that costs nothing to read and is even easier to forward. Just a line that said I was about to compete in the state final, that the stream link was below, and that I wished my parents could be there, but they were already committed to hosting for Ben, and if the message felt like bait, that is because it was. A small hook baited with the truth, and I knew exactly what it would do in a room full of people who thrive on appearing supportive. Then I did something that will sound petty unless you have lived in a family where appearances are the currency, because I texted my cousin Ivy, who is one of those rare people who will show up in sweatpants and say the thing everyone else is circling, and I asked her, point blank, to put the stream on at the barbecue as background, not as a big announcement, just a casual, let's see how she's doing that would sit there like a mirror in the middle of their afternoon, and I promised her I would owe her a favor the next time she needed someone to say the bold thing, so she did not have to, and she sent back a single line that said, say less, which made me laugh. Because if you knew how many times I have swallowed words in that house, you would understand how liberating it felt to line up a small act that would force them to hear me whether they meant to or not. I checked the program to make sure there was no scripted thank you that included family names, because I was done giving people credit for seats they did not take, and I asked the tournament director, who likes me and also likes drama when it is tidy, whether the post on the league account could go up quickly with the video clip once the winners were announced, not because I wanted likes, but because I wanted the record set before anyone revised it, and he said sure in that breezy way people say yes, when they do not know they're about to become part of a long overdue boundary. Somewhere in there, before the final round started, my dad texted a photo from the barbecue that looked like a beer commercial if you do not know the backstory, and he wrote, "We are cheering from here," which would have been sweet if it had come with a calendar invite a week ago or a real conversation about timing, but as it stood it read like a caption on a postcard from a place they chose over me, so I wrote back, "You can actually cheer from there. Here's the link," and I pasted it again. Not because I believed he would click it, but because I wanted the paper trail that says I tried, and then I put my phone face down, because the only thing worse than being ignored is watching it in real time while you are supposed to be brave. I wish I could tell you I made all these moves without doubt and that my hands did not shake, but the truth is I felt that low hum of panic people get when they finally stop playing a role and worry they will regret it, and I had a quick, ugly thought about whether this made me a bad daughter, whether I was turning into the kind of person who sets traps, and then I remembered every time I had taken the high road and ended up alone on it, and I decided that protecting yourself is not the same as being cruel, especially when the trap is nothing more than the truth shown at volume. Right before we were called, Ivy texted again to say she had the stream up on the patio television, not announced, just there in the corner with the sound at a level people could not ignore. And that my mom had put a hand to her mouth in that performative way she does when something inconvenient catches her off guard, and that Ben made a face like someone had turned on an air conditioner when he wanted the windows open. Which made me bite back a smile I am not ashamed of, because if they would not come to me, then my voice could still reach them where they were, and no one could pretend they did not know. Not today, not this time. And, because I did not want the final act to depend on anyone else's conscience or attention span, I set one more piece in place that would land after the trophies, but before the backpedaling. A simple scheduled post on my own page with a short video of my practice rounds and a caption that thanked the people who actually showed up in my life by name, not titles, and you might wonder why that matters. But when you grow up in a house where vague praise is a way to keep the golden child untarnished, Saying names is an act of clarity, and clarity is its own kind of strike, which is exactly what I needed as I stood to be called and felt my phone buzz one more time in my bag with a message I did not read yet. Because the last thing I did before walking toward the podium was look at Hannah and say, very steady, that after they called my name I was going to speak one line that was not in my remarks, and she nodded like she had been waiting years to hear me say it out loud. And then, the house manager opened the door and I stepped into the aisle knowing that, somewhere across town, my words were already in their backyard. When they called my name and I walked to the lectern, I could feel that strange quiet that shows up when you are done trying to charm your way into being valued and you finally decide to prove something without asking permission. And while I have stood in front of people many times with a calm face and a steady voice, this was the first time I felt like I had stepped out of the role my family assigned me and into the version of myself I had been building in private, the one who does not shrink to make room for someone else's weekend plans, and I could tell the shift was real because my hands, which always shake a little at the start, did not, and the air did not press down on my chest the way it sometimes does when I am still hoping for someone's approval. And instead there was that clean, narrow focus you get when the goal is simple and you are finally ready to do it. The topic landed, and I knew within a breath that the research I had dragged through late nights would hold because the arguments lined up like a row of dominoes I had placed carefully, each one tagged to evidence that had receipts and not just vibes. And I let myself look at the judges' faces for a heartbeat, not because I was trying to read them, but because I wanted to remind myself that they were professionals who cared about the work, not my family, not my history, just the strength of what I put forward, and that reminder washed something bitter out of me long enough to make room for a better fuel, which is the honest desire to be good at what you do whether or not anyone is clapping from a folding chair. My opponent started strong with the kind of polished opening people post online for motivational content, and I let it move past me like a bus I had no intention of boarding. Because when it was my turn I chose to speak like the person I am when I am not trying to sound impressive, which does not mean casual and unprepared. It means direct and built on facts I respect, and I said what needed saying in long, connected lines that laid out the costs and the trade-offs and the real-world people who get squeezed when leaders promise one thing and follow through on another, and while I talked I could feel the room tracking with me the way a room does when they recognize that you are not playing at being smart, you are being clear. In cross-examination my opponent tried to rush me into a corner with a false choice, and I let the silence sit for a long few seconds, long enough for the audience to notice the tactic. And then I did something I learned from years of being pushed to the edge of conversations at home, which is that I stepped out of the trap by naming it, describing the missing option he had just erased, and anchoring my answer in the policy language that made the erasure obvious and a little embarrassing, and I did it without heat, because I've learned that calm can cut sharper than volume when you want the moment to land in the memory of whoever is watching from a patio television with a plastic cup in their hand. Somewhere between rebuttal and closing I felt my phone buzz once in my bag on the floor, and, because I had already made my promises to myself I let it buzz without breaking eye contact with the chair. And in that second I understood a small thing that used to sound like a cliché when adults said it, which is that you are always teaching people how to treat you, not with lectures or speeches, but with how you behave when it matters. And the way I behaved was to keep the focus on the argument, too. Keep the receipts tight, and to let the stubborn part of my heart that wanted my parents to walk in and wave from the back go quiet so the part of me that wanted to win could breathe. In the closing I did something that probably made a few purists roll their eyes and also made me sleep better that night, because I tucked one line into the final 30 seconds that fit the topic cleanly and carried my private message without breaking the rules. And I said that policies are only as credible as the people who show up for them when it is inconvenient, that commitments measured by attendance and not by captions are the ones that hold communities together, and I let my eyes rest on the camera lens without apology as I said it, not pleading, not accusing, just stating the standard aloud so that anyone listening could decide whether they met it, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I was not only arguing a case, I was reclaiming my own. When the timekeeper flashed the signal I ended exactly where I meant to end, with a sentence that landed flat and firm and did not chase applause, and then I stepped back and let the rush hit me, the way it pours in only after you are finished. And I stood there with my hands folded and looked at Hannah, who tilted her head the tiniest bit in that proud way that never makes a scene, and I realized it mattered more than I had admitted that at least one adult in the building had built there. Afternoon around me instead of asking me to fold into someone else's plans, which is a kind of generosity that does not require a barbecue to advertise itself. While we waited for the panel to confer, I finally pulled my phone from my bag and saw a stack of messages that read like a timeline of shifting faces. My mom with a stream of exclamation points that said she had just learned how to cast the video and that I looked so confident and that the food had taken longer than expected. My dad with a line about how the neighbors were impressed and how maybe they could swing by for the photos if traffic was not bad. Ivy with a lean little text that said, "The stream had quieted the patio in that way a mirror quiets a room," and then Ben, who did not write anything at all, but sent a single selfie from a car with the kind of jaw that means he had finally remembered that I am not a decoration in the background of his life, and the map icon under it told me he was not at the grill anymore. I put the phone away because whatever was coming did not belong in my hands just yet, and when the doors opened and the judges filed back in with their folders, I felt that breathless second where everyone in the room becomes the same person hoping for the same announcement, and I stood where the floor tape told me to stand, and I reminded myself of the promise I made at the start of the night, that if my name was called I would take one moment to set the record straight in public without shouting, and that I would do it in a way that could not be edited into a misunderstanding later, because the lesson I had finally learned was that soft boundaries get treated like suggestions, and I was done suggesting. They began with the acknowledgments and the speaker awards, the usual rhythm that always feels too slow when you are waiting for the only line that matters, and I watched the faces around me brighten and fall and brighten again. And somewhere near the back a door opened with the kind of hush that means someone came in late and tried to be invisible, and I did not turn to look, because I wanted the first time I saw whatever had just arrived to happen on my terms, not as a reflex, and when the chair finally paused and said the words that start a life tilting, I felt my stomach drop and rise at the same time because I knew the next minute would either lock a door shut or blow it open. What happened after my name was said is the part you are waiting for, and the part one had been building toward since the moment the barbecue photo hit my screen, and I promise you it did not happen by accident or by heat of the moment courage. It happened because I chose the words days ago and wrote them down and practiced them until they felt like the truth and not a performance, which is why, when the photographer waved us toward the banner and the microphones edged closer, I already knew that I was going to lift my chin, look into the lens that was streaming to a backyard, and deliver one clean line that would make the room go quiet in that particular way a final boundary does. And if you are wondering whether Ben made it through the doors in time to hear it, you should know that the last text Ivy sent before I slipped the phone away said he had just parked and was walking fast, which means the timing could not have been better. And that is exactly where I am going to leave you. Standing at the edge of the photo lights with the sentence ready and the door opening behind me. When they finally called my name and handed me the plaque that had felt like a fantasy in all the years I stayed up building arguments alone at my desk while the rest of the house slept, I walked to the center of the stage with the weight of something that was not just wood and metal, but every moment I had been asked to shrink so someone else could expand, and for once I did not try to disguise the fact that this moment belonged to me and no one else, because the applause was steady and the lights were hot, and the cameras were pointed directly at my face, and there was no way to pretend it was anyone else's achievement or anyone else's labor, and that clarity carried me through the awkward shuffle of lining up for the photos. Because I knew exactly what was coming, and I had rehearsed it until the words felt like a muscle that would not fail when I needed it most. The photographer called for the usual smiles, the kind that end up on websites and in newsletters and get scrolled past by strangers, and I smiled. Not because I was trying to play along, but because the line I had chosen to deliver would land harder if my expression was calm. And I waited until the shutter clicks fell into a rhythm and the room grew just restless enough to be paying attention without realizing it, and then I tilted my head the slightest bit toward the nearest camera, the one I knew was streaming not only to the official page but also into the corner of a backyard full of people who had chosen barbecue smoke over me, and I said it in a tone that was level and unmistakable, not bitter, not shaky, just exact. This is for the people who did not show. The silence that followed was almost cinematic in how quickly it replaced the polite laughter that had filled the room seconds earlier, because people did not expect me to break script, and you could feel them deciding in real time whether it was an offhand joke, a slip of the tongue, or something much sharper, and in that half-second pause I saw faces flicker with recognition, because anyone who has ever been the overlooked child, the backup friend, the one who got brushed off in favor of someone easier, understood immediately that this was not improvisation. This was a line sharpened by years of swallowing smaller ones, and once you understand that, you cannot unhear it. Hannah's eyes met mine from the side of the stage, and while she did not move or react outwardly, I could see the faintest quirk of her mouth, the kind that says you just witnessed someone step fully into their skin. And the first year who had been filming gripped the phone tighter, which told me he knew he had captured something he would replay later, not just because it was dramatic, but because it was honest, and honesty at the exact wrong moment is what people remember longest. Out of the corner of my eye I caught movement at the back of the hall, and I did not need to confirm who it was because the weight in my stomach already knew. Ben had walked in. Not with the swagger he usually carried, but with the stiff energy of someone arriving too late and knowing it, and while I did not look directly at him because the camera was still on me, I felt the exact second he heard my words, because the air changed. The way it does when a storm finally cracks, and the next sound after my sentence was the scrape of a chair being shoved back as he stormed out before the flashbulbs finished. The photographer hesitated, confused, because the line had broken the rhythm, and people around me started whispering, trying to piece together whether it was a private jab or a public strike. And in that swirl of uncertainty, I kept my smile steady and faced forward, because the only thing worse than making the cut would have been looking guilty about it, and I wanted the photos to be clean proof that I had said it calmly, without apology, in the middle of my own victory. Later people would ask if I regretted saying it, if I thought it was too much, if I worried it burned bridges I might need someday, but in that moment the only thought I had was how good it felt to let the truth hang in the air without being swallowed. Because for years I had edited myself down to avoid making a scene, and this time the scene was the point, the statement was the punctuation, and the cameras were the insurance that no one could twist it back into something softer. As the photos wrapped and the officials moved us off stage, my phone buzzed nonstop in my bag, and I knew without even opening it that the texts would be a mix of outrage, defensiveness, and attempts to minimize. Because that is how people who are used to being protected react when the script gets rewritten in public, and I let it buzz while I walked down the hallway with the plaque pressed to my side. Because the truth had already landed and I did not need their acknowledgement to confirm it, I had just said it into a microphone with every witness I needed. When I finally stepped outside and felt the cool air hit my face, I thought for a second that maybe the weight would lift, that maybe saying it out loud would clear the ledger and let me breathe easier. But the truth is it did not, at least not right away. Because winning does not erase the years that came before it, and calling someone out does not erase the ache of wishing they had chosen differently, and that tension sat in my chest even as I walked to the car with Hannah and the first year. Still grinning like he had been front row at a plot twist, because the strike was satisfying, but it was not simple, and the silence that followed it was heavier than the applause. And that is where I stood that night, holding both the trophy and the sentence I had been carrying for years, knowing that the fallout was already building on the other side of my phone screen, because families do not stay quiet when you expose the pattern, they scramble. They accuse, they rewrite, and while I did not know exactly how ugly it would get, I knew enough to understand that my calm line on stage had just started a fight that would not end with the ceremony, which is why I took one last long look at the building behind me and braced myself, because the aftermath was going to hurt, and hurt publicly, and I was finally ready to let it. The hours after the ceremony moved in a blur that did not feel celebratory in the way I had once imagined it would, because instead of clinking glasses with people I loved or laughing off the stress of competition with my family, I found myself walking through a stream of messages that piled up so quickly I could hardly tell which ones were meant to congratulate me and which ones were meant to scold me, since they blended into one long wall of words, some sharp, some pleading, some defensive. and some pretending nothing unusual had been said, but none of them giving me what I had wanted most, which was the simple recognition that I had been worth showing up for from the start. My mom's texts came first, frantic and filled with explanations that read less like apologies and more like rehearsed cover stories. Lines about how the food was already prepped and the guests were expecting them, and how they had tried to put the stream on but could not get it working right away, as if the fact that they eventually watched absolved them from not being there in the room where I needed them, and while she repeated that she was proud of me, I could feel the hollowness beneath the words because pride is cheap when it only shows up after someone else has already clapped. My dad's responses arrived a little later and sounded like the same easy humor he always fell back on when conflict pressed too close, joking that at least my comment had made the photos memorable and that people were talking about me now, as if the point of a daughter's hard work was publicity rather than acknowledgement, and he tossed in a half-hearted suggestion that maybe we could do a dinner next week to celebrate properly, which made me laugh out loud in a way that was not amused, because you do not skip the wedding and then offer to drop by for cake a week later, not if you understand what presence actually means, and I realized in that moment that he would never really understand. Because to him the absence would always be softened by excuses, and the strike would always be framed as an overreaction. The call that came from Ben, though, was different in tone, not defensive or apologetic but sharp and cutting, because he did not waste time on explanations or guilt. He went straight to anger, telling me that I had humiliated him in front of people who respected him, that I had turned my moment into a cheap shot, and that I should have kept family matters private instead of airing them out like dirty laundry. And I let him speak without interrupting because there was nothing he could say that would shift the fact that the entire sequence of events had been his choice, starting with his barbecue that pulled the center of gravity away from me and ending with his dramatic storming out, which made it clear that my words had landed exactly where they needed to land. I told him calmly that he was furious not because I lied, but because I told the truth in a place where the truth was impossible to spin, and his silence in that second told me I had cut closer than he expected, and the call ended abruptly with him saying he was done talking for now, which was fine by me, because I had already said everything that needed to be said into the microphone where everyone could hear. The next day was stranger than the night before, because the text slowed, but the consequences deepened, with relatives weighing in to say they understood my frustration, but wished I had handled it differently. Neighbors chiming in to say they had never realized how often I was left out, and a few old friends writing that the clip had been passed around and made them cheer out loud, and while it was tempting to scroll endlessly through every reaction, I forced myself to step back and remember that the win had been real regardless of the fallout, and the point was not to win approval after the fact, but to stop waiting for approval in the first place. Hannah called that afternoon and said something I will never forget, that I had done what most people only dream of doing, which was taking the part of the story that had been used to shrink me and flipping it in a single sentence into proof of my strength. And she warned me gently that the silence at home might last longer than I thought, but that sometimes silence is not punishment, it is space finally opening for you to breathe. And she was right, because when the initial noise of messages and calls faded, what was left was not reconciliation but a cold, heavy quiet that stretched through days and then weeks, broken only by small, awkward attempts from my mom to mention the win without mentioning the strike, and one brief note from my dad asking about logistics for Thanksgiving, which made it clear that avoidance would be their chosen path rather than reckoning. And as much as part of me wanted to drag the conversation back into the light and force them to admit what they had done, another part of me realized that silence, while painful, was also a kind of proof, because it meant they had heard me clearly enough that they had nothing to counter with and nothing to stand on. So they stayed quiet. For the first time in years, I did not chase that silence with explanations or apologies. I let it sit where it landed, and in that stillness I discovered something I had never quite trusted before, which is that peace does not always come from fixing things. Sometimes it comes from refusing to fix them anymore, and as much as I wished my family dynamic could have been different, I felt the weight shift inside me when I realized that I had already won the only victory that mattered, which was choosing to believe in my own worth without waiting for anyone else to validate it. And even though part of me still aches when I think about the empty seats at that final, the ache no longer feels like evidence of my failure to be enough. It feels like evidence of their failure to show up, and that is a truth I will no longer edit. The clip of my remark still circulates now and then, sometimes resurfacing on feeds with comments from strangers who recognize their own families in my line, and every time I see it I feel both proud and unsettled. Because I know the moment was not just about triumph, but about drawing a line in ink that cannot be erased, and while that line has left me more alone in some ways, it has also left me freer, because once you know you can survive the silence, you stop fearing it. And once you stop fearing silence, you stop bargaining for crumbs. So when people ask if I would do it again, if I regret the bluntness, if I wish I had found a softer way, I tell them honestly that the only regret I would have carried would be biting my tongue one more time. Because families have a way of convincing you that silence is noble when in reality it is just convenient for the ones who benefit from it, and I decided that night that I was finished being convenient. And maybe they will never forgive me, maybe the distance will last longer than I want, but one thing is certain, they will never forget it, because I made sure the sentence was said out loud, into a microphone, in front of cameras, with no way to rewrite it afterward, and in the end that was my real victory, the one that mattered more than the trophy itself.